Thanks for everybody coming today. Today you're going to get what I think is going to be a very interesting presentation. Rory is a PhD student with me who's studying the use of breath, not just to manage stress, but to achieve optimal states. And he's a practitioner as well as becoming a scientist. So he has a couple of interesting angles on the subject. So without further ado, Rory, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Joseph, and thank you for everyone for being here today. It's such a funny time to be doing a presentation like this when we can't be more than 5 kilometers from home, but I appreciate you staying home and being here for this today. As Joseph mentioned, my interest is in optimal breathing and how it relates to optimal well-being. So my research question is about what is optimal breathing and how it relates to well-being and ultimately developing and validating a measure of optimal breathing. So I'd like to thank Joseph and Belginder for their support thus far. It's a topic that I'm especially passionate about and looking forward to delving into with you. So the overarching aim of my research is to conceptualize, to measure, and to establish the relevance of optimal breathing for well-being, so that researchers and practitioners can more accurately guide breathing-based interventions to improve well-being. As Joseph mentioned, I myself have been a practitioner in this space for a little while and have a few different angles to it. And essentially how I came to this topic is through the realization that breathing interventions can greatly improve well-being and health. Breathing has been used for dating back thousands of years to improve health and well-being related outcomes. It's more recently been used to reduce stress, to reduce anxiety, to reduce pain, to reduce depression, reduce blood pressure, increase resilience, and even increase positive affect, and also reduce negative affect. So breathing is well established in how it can influence these well-being related outcomes, but a theme that you probably see already is that they are often very deficit based, and that's something I'll touch on more as I go. But first, a wide range of breathing interventions have had these beneficial effects. So when we talk about breathing, we could be talking about diaphragmatic breathing, could be talking about yoga breathing, and even that itself is a wide range of different methods involving breath holding or slowing the breath and various manipulations of the breath. Or more recently, we could be talking about things like heart rate variability biofeedback, which is measuring heart rate in real time and noticing as you inhale how your heart rate increases, and as you exhale your heart rate decreases, and slowing the breathing and breathing in a rhythm at the individual's resonant frequency where it maximizes these fluctuations in heart rate. Or we could be talking about the Buteyko method or the Wim Hof method and all these different types of breathing interventions. And so because there's such a wide variety of methods available for practitioners to utilize for therapeutic aims or for well-being related aims, I feel like it's especially important that we measure how these interventions work so that we can be more specific about who will benefit from what method at what time and what way. So surprisingly, with all this research around the effects of breathing on these well-being related outcomes, research that utilizes breathing typically doesn't actually measure breathing. So most interventions in this space, they deliver a method of breathing, and for a period of time, maybe it's 20 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And at the end, they track the outcomes that they've used it for. So that may be, has it reduced stress over 8 weeks, or has it reduced depression over 8 weeks? But the intervention, although it involves breathing, hasn't actually measured breathing and whether breathing itself, the individual subject's ability to breathe, has actually changed. And so this ultimately limits our ability to prescribe specific breathing protocols for individuals, because we don't know how an individual's breathing has actually changed from an intervention. We just know whether that intervention has had effects on their stress or any other outcome like that. So I was very surprised when I went looking for a measure of optimal breathing that there actually wasn't one. Current measures of breathing, there are many measures of breathing currently, but they focus on dysfunction. And so by focusing on dysfunction, they can serve a purpose in a therapeutic sense when if an individual has severe kind of breathing symptoms, or maybe is asthmatic, or has some other kind of dysfunction that is leading them to see a respiratory specialist. But for general populations, I'm not sure many of us have ever thought to go and have our breathing assessed or measured. But I think we're ultimately missing an opportunity with this, because these measures of breathing dysfunction, whilst useful for those specific aims, they don't actually necessarily help us to understand if someone is breathing optimally. And as is these measures of breathing typically cover 3 dimensions. They either look at the biochemical aspect of breathing, so whether you're exhaling the right amount of carbon dioxide, whether your lungs are actually working effectively, or they look at the biomechanics, like are you breathing from your diaphragm, or are you breathing from your upper chest, or they look at the psychophysiological dimension, which is more of the subjective symptoms. But as I'm sure everyone in this session today knows, the absence of dysfunction doesn't necessarily mean the presence of optimal function. And this is really the kind of ground upon which I'm standing for presenting my case for this research, is that the implicit goal behind existing measures of breathing is to reduce or eliminate dysfunction. But is that the ultimate goal of what's possible for breathing? And would we be better to also have a more aspirational aim of becoming more optimal in our breathing? So a key question for me is to simply define what is optimal breathing, so that we can establish a valid measure of it. And so to begin with that, I've drawn on the dysfunctional breathing literature as a starting point to say, well, if we were to explore the opposites of existing measures of dysfunction, what would the opposite of that look like? So not just the absence of a disorder, but the opposite, which is similar to, I know, what has been done within positive psychology. And so optimal biochemistry may be breathing slowly, breathing low, breathing light. Optimal biomechanics is using the diaphragm and primarily breathing through the nose. Optimal psychophysiology is that the breath feels satisfying and easy. And this is just some examples drawing upon the literature that I've explored. And this framework has led me to propose that optimal breathing is the combination really of 2 things. It is 2 factors. One is positive breathing habits. So your normal breathing, we take around 20,000 breaths a day. Are those 20,000 breaths in the way we habitually breathe, are they optimal? Are they helping our health and well-being? Are we breathing through our nose primarily, for example? And it's not enough, I don't think, though, to just have positive breathing habits, because we can also use our breath intentionally to exert changes over how we feel and over the nervous system itself. And so that factor we're calling the effective use. So our conceptualization of optimal breathing thus far is that it is the combination of positive breathing habits, which is that default pattern that you have, and then also the effective use of your breathing more intentionally in order to optimize your state for desired aims. And so this is what I'm going to be exploring through a series of studies. But study one is looking at a systematic review of studies that include a measure of breathing and a measure of well-being. So studies must include at least one aspect of one measure of breathing and at least one well-being construct. So for example, PANAS, the positive and negative affective states as a measure of well-being, subjective well-being, psychological well-being, etc. So if studies have measured at least an aspect of breathing and also a well-being outcome, they will be included in the initial pool. Our strategy is to use Medline, PsycInfo, and Scopus databases with keywords in those following categories of breath, measure, and well-being. And I can say from what we've done so far on this is that there's actually not that many studies that do measure breathing. And so it's an open question at this stage whether we're going to be able to pull enough for a meta-analysis, but our expectation is that there will not end up being all that many studies that do measure breathing and the aspect of wellbeing in that way. So titles and abstracts will be screened by 2 reviewers using covenants. The full text screening will determine the final inclusion. And as I alluded to, we're expecting a small number of studies that measure both well-being and breathing, particularly well-being as defined as not just deficit. So what we've found is an overwhelming amount of research around measures of breathing and deficit outcomes such as stress. So if there's already existing reviews and meta-analyses about many aspects of breathing and its role in stress. So there's nothing new particularly to add there, but where there is this gap that we've identified is in well-being as it's more positively defined. And our moderation hypothesis is that the deficit measures of breathing will be more strongly linked to deficit outcomes than positive outcomes. And this is a really key point for what I'm doing through all my studies is really looking at deficit measures we expect to link with deficit outcomes, and therefore we expect a more positive measure of optimal breathing to link with more positive outcomes. And I'll talk more about that as we go. My second study, which will build, so that first systematic review and potential meta-analysis will help understand the territory upon which I'm working. But as I said, we're not expecting it to show up too many studies that actually measure breathing and well-being. But that leads into the second study, which is to develop and validate a practical measure of optimal breathing. And this is what I'm really excited about, is to first conceptualize optimal breathing. And as you've seen above, we've made a start on that with those 2 factors of positive breathing habits and effective use of breathing. Turning that into a pool of items to create a scale. Engaging with an expert panel to review both the conceptualization and the potential items, so that we're both drawing upon the literature around theoretically what optimal breathing could be, but also the expertise of practitioners and researchers who are engaged in this space. Once the scale is created and reviewed by the panel, we will then do a cross-sectional analysis using Qualtrics with a sample of 300 participants, which will give us sufficient power to understand whether our measure achieves the following, which is is it different enough from existing measures, and is it similar enough to really be to be valid and to be capturing what we're intending it to capture. So Specifically, what we're expecting is moderate correlations between dysfunctional breathing measures. So we're going to use the self-evaluation of breathing questionnaire, which is a validated measure of dysfunctional breathing. And so we're expecting our optimal breathing measure to correlate moderately with that, but to be distinct from it. Likewise, we're expecting moderate correlations with well-being, and to use the well-being pro for that. With mindfulness as well, is our measure of optimal breathing distinct from mindfulness? Breath awareness is a huge part of mindfulness, and we expect our measure to be distinct, but obviously to also to correlate somewhat with it. And psychological flexibility using the acceptance and action questionnaire, again, we expect a moderate correlation there. So with study 2, hopefully establishing the validity of this measure, then that will enable researchers such as ourselves, but then obviously other researchers to measure the effectiveness of any breathing intervention. And that's what we'll delve deeper into in study 3, which is specifically about, does the new measure of optimal breathing respond to breathing intervention? So we expect that it will change with intervention. So an individual's scores on optimal breathing will increase after a breathing intervention. And this is really to determine whether, and to further validate the scale for its usefulness and effectiveness in detecting improvements in breathing. And so this study is particularly interesting to me, and we've been quite ambitious with how we go about it. But most simply, it is about this cross-sectional analysis. Most simply, it's about a pre and post test of provide individuals with the baseline assessments of well-being and optimal breathing, and then after a breathing intervention, has their optimal breathing increased according to our scale. We also hypothesize, though, that optimal breathing will mediate the relationship between breathing interventions and positive wellbeing outcomes. So that model is shown here, that if we provide a breathing intervention or practice, that optimal breathing will increase, and that will explain the positive wellbeing outcomes from those practices. So the approach we're taking to this involves the combination of physiological and psychological data, which is a secondary aim, but an important one, in that we want to show that it's not only the subjective measures of breathing from our optimal breathing measure that change from intervention, but also that objective measures that are physiological indicators of well-being also change with breathing intervention, and this will support, if that is the case, that will support the fact that our optimal breathing measure is responsive to changes beyond just self-report. So to do that, we're interested in monitoring sleep, resting heart rate variability, and respiratory rate. And of those, respiratory rates obviously particularly important, as an indicator of someone's baseline breathing habits. And because in this study we're proposing the respiratory rate will be measured during sleep, that gives additional validity to the fact that the individuals are not trying to control it, that it is a habitual thing, respiratory rate. So there's we would expect to see for a lot of people that they're with breathing intervention that their respiratory rate lowers slightly, and the lowering of the respiratory rate would be an indicator of a physiological improvement. So for this study, we'll use, I'll talk about how we're going to measure those physiological indicators shortly, but we will be doing a pre and post test of the Wellbeing Pro and the pre and post test of our optimal breathing measure, and this has sufficient power from our sample size of, we're aiming to have 50 people in the study. And in order to answer our core question of, is our optimal breathing measure responsive to intervention, and how does that relate to well-being? And for the physiological data, we're building off of existing work that's been done using Oura rings and Samsung watches, and a particular algorithm or a particular framework for analysing this data called the Wellbeat framework. We will be using the Oura ring to wear at night so that it gets nighttime heart rate variability, sleep, and respiratory rate. The Oura ring is chosen specifically because it has been validated as being very accurate, particularly for heart rate and respiratory rate indicators and overall sleep time. And that's because the finger is a better site for measuring for measuring those indicators than the wrist. But in the daytime, the Samsung watch, with the help of the Wellbeat framework of analysis, is actually superior for measuring ongoing heart rate and ongoing heart rate variability and also activity. And so this will give us a huge amount of physiological data for each individual in the study, through which to achieve our aims that I've outlined before about assessing what physiological markers also change with breathing intervention, and how do they correlate with changes in our optimal breathing measure. And so a kind of higher level model that we're looking at for this third study is, we've got the breathing practice or intervention, and the two aspects of our optimal breathing measure at the top here: positive breathing habits, effective breathing use, leading to positive wellbeing outcomes. But also, it is possible that reducing dysfunctional breathing is a mediator, or potentially mindfulness or psychological flexibility are mediators. So that's a theoretical model that we're kind of been drawing the study together from. So ultimately, what gets measured gets managed, and that's the reason why I think it's so important that we conceptualize and establish a measure of optimal breathing, so that researchers, practitioners, and even individuals have clearer goalposts to aim for. If we're wanting to use breathing for wellbeing related aims, then being more specific in how we utilize it for best effects through actually measuring it will enable this to happen. So that's the crux of what I'm proposing, and the timeline for that is study 1 we're planning on commencing shortly after this COC, and then study 2 in the early stages of next year, with the third study, once we've established the optimal breathing measure in study 2, we will then be able to draw on those findings to better inform study 3 and any refinements we need to make to that to achieve the aims. So I will stop the screen share and say thank you and open up for conversation and questions.